The house didn't feel different after he said it, but the meaning of everything inside it already had. A 4-bedroom suburban home in the United States sounds simple on paper: mortgage, insurance, property tax, utilities. But in reality, it is a layered financial system that most people only understand when something breaks. And what was breaking now wasn't the walls or the structure. It was the assumption of who controlled the flow of money that kept it standing. On the kitchen counter, bills were still sitting in neat stacks: mortgage statements from a local bank, auto loan notices for a car parked outside, credit card summaries with rotating balances, and grocery receipts that looked ordinary until you understood they were part of a larger pattern of cash flow responsibility. Nothing about them was emotional. Everything about them was mechanical. That's what most people miss. They think households run on relationships. But financially, households run on allocation: who pays, when they pay, and under what legal structure those payments exist. I had learned to see that long before anyone in the room started speaking about divorce. Not because I wanted to, but because when you're the one quietly reviewing bank statements late at night, you stop seeing a home as a place and start seeing it as a system of transactions. Insurance premiums tied to risk. Mortgage interest tied to debt structure. Credit cards tied to revolving liability. Even grocery spending becomes a pattern of consumption that tells you more about financial behavior than any argument ever could. That's why I wasn't reacting the way they expected me to. They saw silence and assumed confusion. They saw calm and assumed lack of power. But what they didn't realize was that I had already spent years understanding how money actually moved through this household. Not emotionally, but structurally. And structure doesn't depend on who speaks the loudest in a room. It depends on what the documents say when no one is speaking at all. My husband continued talking somewhere behind me, still framing everything in terms of control, intention, and narrative. But those are not financial categories. They are emotional ones. And emotional categories don't appear on mortgage contracts or insurance policies. Across the room, the younger white woman remained still. People often underestimated her because she didn't perform financial authority the way others expected. She wasn't loud about money. She didn't turn every conversation into status. But that was exactly why she understood more than they assumed. Because she had been paying attention to details that others ignored: names on accounts, signatures on documents, the way responsibilities were actually assigned rather than assumed. That kind of understanding is invisible until it becomes undeniable. The quiet white billionaire mentor shifted slightly in his seat, not reacting to the tension, but observing the structure beneath it. He wasn't interested in who felt right. He was watching for something more precise: whether the financial reality of the situation matched the story being told in the room. It rarely does. People think legal and financial systems respond to emotion. They don't. They respond to records, to filings, to documentation that exists independently of conflict. That's why arguments rarely matter in the end, because they don't exist in the same system that determines ownership or responsibility. A family can argue about who deserves a house, but the bank only recognizes who signed the loan. A couple can debate contribution, but the insurance company only recognizes policyholders. A room full of people can assign blame, but the court only recognizes evidence. And that's where the real shift always happens. Not in the conversation, in the paperwork. My hand was still resting near the folder on the table, the one thing no one had opened yet, the one thing everyone was slowly beginning to avoid looking at directly. Because instinctively, people recognize when something in a room is no longer symbolic. It's structural, and what was inside that folder wasn't just information. It was about to become the only version of events that could survive outside the room. What most people in that room still didn't understand, what most people in situations like this never understand until it's too late, is that financial conflict is almost never about who is speaking correctly in the moment. It is about who has been living inside the correct system all along. And that is where the biggest false beliefs begin to collapse. The first false belief is that silence equals weakness. People naturally assume that the person who isn't arguing, who isn't interrupting, who isn't defending themselves in real time must be losing control. But in financial reality, silence is often what happens when someone is operating on a different layer of understanding, not reacting emotionally, but observing structurally. The second false belief is that not showing wealth means not having it. In a world built on appearances, People confuse visibility with stability. They assume that because someone isn't performing financial confidence, they must lack it. But real financial position is rarely visible in behavior. It is visible in documents, in account structures, in legal names, and in how obligations are actually assigned. The third false belief is even more dangerous, that being inside a home means having ownership over it. A home feels emotional, personal, shared, but legally it is not defined by presence. It is defined by title, mortgage agreements, and recorded responsibility. You can live inside something completely without ever owning it in the eyes of the system that matters. Then there is the fourth false belief, that income equals financial power. People see salary, lifestyle, or spending habits and assume they reflect true wealth. But income is just flow. It moves. It changes. It disappears. Assets are what remain. Liabilities are what quietly extract value over time. Most people are looking at movement and assuming it is ownership. And finally, the most fragile belief of all, that emotion can override documentation. It cannot. Because emotion exists in conversation, but financial systems exist in records. This is where the contrast becomes unavoidable. Looking rich is not the same as owning assets. Looking confident is not the same as controlling legal structure. Making monthly payments is not the same as owning what those payments are attached to. And loud accusations in a room do not erase quiet documents that were signed, filed, and recorded long before anyone started speaking. That distinction is what most people miss when they watch a situation like this unfold. They focus on tone instead of title. They focus on confidence instead of cash flow. They focus on presence instead of legal structure. But none of those things determine who actually holds responsibility in a financial system. I found myself thinking about that as the room continued to shift around me. People still trying to interpret the situation emotionally, still trying to assign meaning based on behavior instead of records. Because if you stop and really ask yourself a hard question, it changes how you see everything. In your own life, what do you assume is true just because it feels true in the moment? Who do you assume is in control, based on personality, rather than paperwork? And what would happen if emotion stopped being part of the interpretation entirely? The quiet white billionaire mentor remained still, watching the same pattern unfold that he had likely seen many times before. Not the argument itself, but the misunderstanding behind it. He didn't look at the people speaking. He looked at the structure underneath what they were saying. Because to him, financial conflict is never about who is right emotionally. It is about whether the system supports what is being claimed. And in this case, the system had already been built long before the divorce was ever announced. Inside the folder on the table, something had already been recorded, signed, and structured in a way that no emotional reaction in the room could change. But no one had opened it yet. And that was the point where the entire situation stopped being about conversation and started becoming about what the documents were about to reveal. The reason situations like this explode in rooms full of people is not because the emotion is high, but because the financial system underneath was never understood in the first place. And once you understand that system in simple terms, everything that looks like conflict starts to look like structure being exposed. At its core, money only moves in two directions. Some things bring money into your control or protect it from leaving your control. Those are assets. And some things quietly pull money out of your control over time, without emotion, without argument, without warning. Those are liabilities. Most people never see the difference clearly until pressure forces it into view. A mortgage, for example, is not just a payment. It is a long-term structure of obligation tied to a property deed. Insurance is not just protection. It is a recurring cost tied to risk. Credit cards are not convenience. They are revolving liabilities that quietly shape cash flow every month. Even something as simple as household spending becomes part of a pattern that reveals who is actually carrying financial responsibility. That is where the second layer appears, cash flow. Cash flow is not about how much money exists in theory. It is about how money actually moves in practice. Who pays the mortgage each month? Who covers insurance renewals? Whose account absorbs the car note? Whose name is tied to the bank statements when balances rise and fall? In financial reality, cash flow behaves like invisible employees working in the background of a household. You don't always see them, but they determine whether the system stays stable or collapses under pressure. And above all of that sits the most important layer, documentation. Because no matter what anyone believes emotionally, financial systems do not run on belief. They run on records. A property deed determines ownership. A title determines legal rights. A prenup determines predefined financial boundaries. Bank statements record actual movement of money. Payment histories show responsibility over time. Even security footage, in certain disputes, becomes a time-stamped record of who was present and when decisions were made. That is why documents act like a wall between emotion and reality. Emotion can argue. Emotion can accuse. Emotion can reinterpret meaning in real time. But documents do not participate in arguments. They simply exist. And when they are opened, they replace interpretation with fact. I kept thinking about that as the folder sat untouched on the table, almost like a neutral object everyone instinctively avoided. Not because it looked powerful, but because it represented something final. Something that could not be talked over or socially redefined. Inside it were not abstract ideas. There were concrete financial records, bank statements showing actual flows of money over time, a property deed tied to legal ownership, structured payment histories that revealed responsibility, and legal documents that defined how assets and obligations were actually divided long before anyone in the room started speaking emotionally. There was also a prenup agreement, not as a symbol, but as a framework, something that existed specifically to prevent emotion from rewriting financial reality after the fact. And the longer the folder remained closed, the more the room filled that gap with assumptions instead of facts. That is how most financial misunderstandings survive. Not because the truth is hidden, but because it hasn't been opened yet. The quiet white billionaire mentor shifted slightly again, his attention not on the people reacting, but on the point where interpretation ends and documentation begins. He understood something most people in the room didn't. Once the evidence is visible, conversation stops being relevant. Because evidence doesn't negotiate. It simply replaces belief. And right now, the only thing standing between belief and reality was a single folder that had not yet been opened fully, but was no longer possible to ignore. The shift in the room didn't happen when anyone spoke louder. It happened when the folder on the table was finally touched, just slightly, like reality itself was being tested to see if it would push back. The man asking for divorce still believed control came from visibility, from tone, from who could frame the story first in front of an audience. But what he didn't notice was that the real structure of the situation had already moved away from him long before this moment. The folder opened halfway, not dramatically, not with emotion, just enough for the first layer of truth to become visible. Inside, the first document was a property deed. Clean, official, stamped with the kind of authority that doesn't need explanation. It didn't care about the tension in the room. It simply stated ownership in legal language that no emotional argument could rewrite. A few people leaned slightly forward, not fully understanding yet what they were looking at, but sensing that the conversation was no longer purely personal. Below it sat a bank statement. One page was marked with a thin red circle, highlighting a consistent pattern of payments that told a story very different from the one being spoken aloud. Mortgage contributions, insurance withdrawals, structured transfers that revealed who had actually been sustaining the financial weight of the property over time. Then came something even more uncomfortable, a payment history log. Not opinions, not assumptions, just timestamps, amounts, and accounts. A timeline of financial responsibility that didn't require interpretation. On the table next to it, a phone lit up briefly with a security video file. Quiet footage, ordinary in appearance, but legally powerful in context. It didn't need sound or explanation. It only needed to show sequence. Further inside the folder was a prenup agreement, folded carefully inside an envelope. Not emotional, not reactive, just pre-established financial boundaries that had been written long before this moment ever arrived. And as if the physical documents weren't enough, the presence of other subtle items in the room started to matter in a different way. A company badge resting quietly inside a handbag, new house keys placed on the edge of the table, a custody-related file sitting on the corner of a nearby desk from an earlier consultation. Each item reinforcing a single idea that was becoming harder to ignore. Everything here was already structured. Nothing was improvising. The younger white American woman didn't react dramatically. She didn't try to dominate the room or reclaim attention. She simply stayed still, her calmness now reading less like passivity and more like preparation finally being recognized. There was no shock on her face, because none of this was new to her. It was simply now visible to everyone else. The quiet white billionaire minter shifted his gaze across the documents once, then back to the people in the room. There was no surprise in his expression, only confirmation. He had already recognized the pattern earlier. This was not a conflict of emotion. It was a conflict between assumed authority and documented reality. And that difference is where most people misjudge power. Because in financial systems, the person who speaks first is not the one in control. The person who has prepared the structure is. Yet in the room, many still hadn't adjusted their understanding. They were still reacting as if confidence could override paperwork, as if presence could override title, as if emotion could override recorded transactions. That belief would not last much longer, because the folder had not yet fully revealed everything it contained. And what came next would not depend on interpretation, but on what the system had already decided long before anyone started speaking. The moment the documents became visible, the atmosphere in the room changed in a way no one was emotionally prepared for, but not because anything loud happened. It changed because pressure finally shifted from people to proof. And pressure, once it moves from emotion to documentation, behaves very differently. At first, the reaction was still emotional. Family members exchanged looks that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with perception. Someone quietly said something about how this looks. Another voice suggested that the situation was being overcomplicated. The same pattern appeared again and again, not a focus on what was true, but on what felt socially acceptable to believe. Because in moments like this, most people are not actually trying to understand financial reality. They are trying to maintain social comfort. The husband, still standing as if the narrative belonged to him, attempted to reframe the situation in familiar emotional terms. Control the tone. Control the interpretation. Control how others in the room were supposed to feel about what was happening. Around him, family pressure began to build in a quieter but more dangerous way. Not through facts, through expectation. The kind of expectation that says things like, "Don't make this difficult, don't embarrass the family, don't turn this into something expensive, don't appear unreasonable." It is the kind of pressure that doesn't sound financial on the surface, but almost always becomes financial in outcome. Because what most people don't realize is that social pressure often has a price tag attached to it. People pay to avoid judgment. They accept financial imbalance to maintain appearance. They stay in obligations longer than they should because leaving would look bad. They take on debt to preserve a lifestyle that signals stability, even when the internal structure is already unstable. And slowly, without noticing, they start confusing emotional acceptance with financial safety. That is how money gets lost quietly in many households, not through dramatic decisions, but through repeated compromises made to avoid discomfort. The younger white American woman remained calm through all of this, not because the pressure wasn't real, but because she was no longer operating in the same framework as the people trying to push her into an emotional response. She was not defending herself in words. She was letting the system speak for her. Across the table, the quiet white billionaire minter observed the shift with the same measured attention he had maintained from the beginning. He didn't react to the accusations. He didn't engage with the emotional framing. He was watching something else entirely. The gap between perception and structure widening as more documents became visible. Because in financial reality, pressure is not measured by how strongly someone speaks. It is measured by who is forced to pay when the speaking stops. The accusations continued, softer now, more socially shaped than legally grounded. Words like fair, reasonable, and appropriate began to replace actual financial terms like ownership, liability, and contractual obligation. That shift alone revealed everything about the level of understanding in the room. Emotion was still trying to negotiate with structure, but structure does not negotiate. It simply holds. And as the folder remained open, revealing more of what had been quietly established long before this moment, something became increasingly clear to those paying attention. The conflict was no longer about what was being said in the room. It was about why the system underneath it had already made certain outcomes unavoidable. And that raised a question no one had fully answered yet. Why someone who understands money would choose to build their position in a way that looks completely opposite to what everyone else in the room believed was normal financial behavior. The room didn't go silent because someone raised their voice. It went silent because the folder was opened fully. Not symbolically, not partially, completely. And once that happened, the argument everyone thought they were having stopped existing as an argument at all. It became a record. The first document placed flat on the table was the property deed. Clear, official, unambiguous. It listed ownership in legal terms that did not depend on emotion, interpretation, or family consensus. The address everyone had been speaking about as ours was not emotionally shared in the way they assumed. It was structurally assigned in a way that only one system recognized: legal ownership. A few people blinked, as if looking harder would change what the page was saying. It didn't. The second document was a mortgage ledger from the bank. Page after page of structured payment history. Not guesses, not claims, actual transactions. Dates, amounts, account identifiers. It showed exactly who had been making the financial contributions that kept the property active, insured, and legally compliant. That was the first moment the emotional framing in the room started to collapse. Because you can argue about relationships. You cannot argue with payment records. Then came the insurance documentation, policy ownership, premium responsibility, renewal history. It confirmed the same pattern. The system did not recognize emotional ownership. It recognized financial responsibility. The husband shifted slightly for the first time since the folder opened fully, but not in confidence anymore. In recalculation. The kind that happens when someone realizes the system they thought they controlled was never operating the way they believed. More pages followed. A signed agreement, a structured prenup, a financial disclosure form tied to legal filing history. Each document added less drama and more clarity. And clarity is what removes control from emotional performance. At this point, no one in the room was speaking loudly anymore. Even the earlier accusations had stopped forming into full sentences. Because there is a very specific moment in financial disputes where people stop arguing and start reading. And reading is where reality takes over. The younger white American woman didn't move. She didn't interrupt. She didn't explain anything. She simply allowed the documents to remain visible because they didn't require interpretation from her. They already contained their own authority. Across the table, the quiet white billionaire mentor finally spoke, not to escalate anything, not to defend anyone, but to summarize what the room was now forced to see. One principle never changes, he said calmly. Ownership is not declared in conflict. It is verified in records. That sentence landed differently than anything else said in the room, because it didn't challenge emotion, it replaced it. Silence followed again, but this time it wasn't confusion. It was recognition. Because what the documents had just proven was not just who owned what. It was who had been financially responsible all along, who had been legally positioned, and who had been operating under assumptions instead of structure. And once that realization settled, the entire direction of the situation shifted from interpretation to consequence. Because when financial records override emotional narratives, the next phase is no longer debate. It is enforcement of what the system already decided long before anyone spoke in that room. The shift from revelation to consequence did not happen loudly. It happened through procedure. Once the documents were fully on the table, the next people to speak were not the family anymore. They were the professionals. The lawyer arrived first, not as a dramatic entrance, but as a confirmation of what the system already recognized. The folder was placed in front of them again, and this time, it wasn't questioned. It was reviewed, page by page, line by line. The property deed was verified against official records. The name on the title matched the legal registry. There was no ambiguity, no emotional interpretation needed. Ownership was not being debated, it was being confirmed. Then came the bank confirmations. The mortgage institution validated the payment history exactly as documented. Monthly payments, account responsibility, and financial continuity all aligned with what the folder already showed. The insurance provider followed with the same pattern. Policy ownership and premium responsibility were consistent with legal filings. In a different room of interpretation, people might have still been arguing. But in this space, interpretation had no authority. Only records did. The result was simple, and it was not dramatic. It was procedural. Access was adjusted based on legal ownership. That meant keys, accounts, and administrative control tied to the property were updated to reflect the title structure. Not as punishment, not as emotion, but as standard enforcement of documented ownership. The house didn't change hands in a theatrical sense. It was aligned with the name already recorded in the system that governed it. And that is the part most people misunderstand about financial consequences. They expect noise, but real financial systems don't produce noise. They produce adjustments. The husband, who had been speaking earlier with confidence, now stood in a different kind of silence. Not emotional collapse, structural realization. The kind that happens when assumptions meet verified records and no longer survive contact with them. No one argued anymore, because there was nothing left to reinterpret. The younger white American woman remained composed throughout the process, not because she was detached, but because nothing she was seeing was new to her. It had already been structured long before the confrontation. The difference now was that everyone else could finally see it. The quiet white billionaire mentor didn't intervene in the process. He didn't need to. Instead, he observed the final alignment with the same calm understanding as before. For him, this was not a victory moment. It was simply what happens when systems are followed correctly. Before the situation fully settled, he offered one final observation, not directed at anyone in particular, but as a principle that applied beyond the room. Financial outcomes are never decided in the moment of conflict, he said quietly. They are decided in the structure built before conflict ever begins. That sentence didn't create reaction. It created understanding, because it explained everything that had just happened without needing emotion to support it. After the legal verification, the practical consequences followed naturally. Accounts were aligned to ownership, structure documentation was archived into enforceable records, access was corrected according to title, and responsibilities were reassigned based on verified financial history. No part of it required force, only confirmation. And once that process was complete, what remained in the room was not conflict anymore. It was clarity. But clarity always leads to something deeper. Because once people see how financial systems actually enforce reality, they begin to question something more personal. How many of their own decisions were made based on emotion instead of documentation, and what would happen if that balance was no longer allowed to exist the same way again? By the time everything had been verified, adjusted, and legally aligned, the room no longer felt like a place where a conflict had happened. It felt like a place where reality had simply replaced assumption. And what remained after that replacement was not noise, not argument, and not emotion. It was understanding. Because once financial systems finish doing what they are designed to do, once titles are confirmed, payments are traced, and responsibility is assigned, there is nothing left for interpretation to compete with. Only structure remains. The quiet white billionaire mentor stood slightly apart from the center of attention, his presence unchanged from the beginning. He had not intervened, not because he was indifferent, but because he understood something most people in the room were only now beginning to grasp. Real financial power does not need to interrupt chaos. It simply outlasts it. The younger white American woman, still calm and composed, was no longer being viewed through the distorted lens of emotional judgment. The assumptions that once defined how others saw her, quiet, underestimated, unimportant in financial decisions, had quietly collapsed under the weight of documentation. What replaced those assumptions was not admiration or resentment. It was clarity. Because clarity is what remains when emotion is no longer allowed to lead interpretation. And in that clarity, the pattern became undeniable. She had never been operating from a place of emotional reaction. She had been operating from structure. The difference is simple but absolute. People who understand money do not rely on arguments to establish control. They rely on ownership, on documented cash flow, on legal responsibility, on systems that continue to function even when voices in the room change tone or direction. That is what the billionaire understood instinctively, and what the rest of the room had slowly been forced to learn. He finally spoke again, not as an interruption, but as a closing reflection on what had already unfolded. Most people think power is proven in how loud you can respond to a situation, he said quietly. But real financial power is proven in how little you need to respond at all. No one challenged that statement, because by that point, challenge itself felt irrelevant. The situation had already moved beyond opinion. It had moved into structure, into records, into systems that existed independently of emotion. And that is where the real lesson settled, not just for the people in the room, but for anyone watching the pattern from the outside. Money is not controlled by who speaks the strongest. It is controlled by who is documented correctly, who is aligned with the title, who is consistent in cash flow responsibility, who understands that paperwork outlives conversation. The younger white American woman remained still, not as someone who had won in an emotional sense, but as someone who had been correctly positioned within a system that finally matched reality. She was not reacting to the outcome. She was simply living in the structure she had already built. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. Because financial security is not something that appears in the moment of conflict. It is something that exists long before conflict ever begins. The final truth of everything that unfolded was not about divorce or confrontation, or who spoke first in a room full of people trying to define reality through emotion. It was about something far more permanent. Ownership cannot be spoken into existence. It has to be recorded. Cash flow cannot be argued into stability. It has to be structured. An identity in money is not built through perception. It is built through systems that remain standing even when everything else becomes uncertain. That is why the final message of what happened in that room was not about winning or losing. It was about understanding. Because in the end, the people who understand money do not need to prove anything through noise. They already built something quieter, stronger, and far more permanent than that. And the final reminder of it all is simple. Don't try to look powerful. Build a life where truth, assets, and documentation quietly protect you even when you say nothing at all.